Hi everyone, Namaste. This is Paramita Chatterjee from Deal Street Asia, and I welcome all of you here to the session titled What are the Next Big Opportunities Unfolding in the Life Sciences Space? Well, to take the discussions forward, we have with us Dr. Amit Verma, Managing Partner of Quadria Capital, a private equity firm that invests exclusively in the healthcare sector in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Well, just to give you a brief background about Dr. Verma, he has been practicing medicine for the last 20 years or so. He's also an investor today. He founded Quadria Capital in 2012 to invest exclusively in the healthcare sector in Asia, which he says has the potential to grow faster than the US and Europe combined by 2025. Well, that's quite a significant target. So given that the sector is going through so much, so without much ado, we'll request Dr. Verma to take us through the contours of healthcare sector in Asia, the abysmally low doctor-patient ratio in some of the markets Quadria invests in, the opportunities and challenges, of course, and the road ahead. So on that note, we welcome you, Dr. Verma, here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me on board. And unfortunately, it took a pandemic to bring healthcare right in center. But hopefully we can make amends as we go forward. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Yeah. So I'll begin with your experience as a doctor turned investor. So as I mentioned earlier, you've been practicing medicine for the last 20 years, and healthcare is a sector that's associated with the social impact theme. On the other hand, of course, we have private equity, which is all about creating profitable ventures. So how have you been able to bridge the divide, and what has been your learning experience in marrying the two?
Paramita, we've always believed at Quadria that healthcare and education are two sectors which have never got their due. As we went about the globe raising money for the past 10 years, what we realized was that there is not a single government which is spending enough money in healthcare. And as I said, unfortunately, it took a pandemic to make it come true. So this is almost out of our pitch book in some ways. We kept saying that at some point of time, regardless of how rich or poor you are going to get caught out. And that's what happened here. We were underprepared both from public infrastructure, private infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, and most importantly, which is my pet peeve, is that we did not have any reliable data. It's like I've been expounding on this saying, if I were to ask you, Paramita, how many diabetics are there in Asia? And you would say 50 million, I would say 500 million. Guess what? Both of us could be right. We don't have any data. So that's what happened in COVID. Everybody was caught unawares. And we ended up in a situation where we had enormous morbidity, enormous mortality. But most importantly, we have taken such an economic hit that we've pushed most of the Asian and emerging economies back by 10 years.
Right, Dr. Verma. That's indeed some food for thought. So we'll move on to the next question, which is slightly big picture. All aspects of life sciences today, be it traditional healthcare, health tech, med tech, pharma or diagnostics, everything has been bustling with activity, as you mentioned, after the pandemic. But even before that, it was quite a darling of the private equity and venture capital firms, the sector per se. So coming back to the pandemic, so what are the distinct themes that have emerged during the pandemic for healthcare overall? That's one question. And second, do you think that's impacted the valuations for startups operating in this space or even otherwise?
So let me start with the second question first, because healthcare, especially in Asia, has always enjoyed, for want of a better English word, insane valuations. There is no logic and science to how healthcare is valued in this part of the world. And I call it a scarcity valuation. There are very few good companies of size that people can invest in. I'm not the only idiot who believes that healthcare is a good business to be in. There are a lot of people who understand the value of being in healthcare. I think our problem has been that we've not been able to raise the kind of companies with the integral ethics and integrity, correct business practices, and I'm not even going to get into ESG being a dominant theme, just being good companies looking at growth. Having said that, however, what the pandemic has done is accelerated the momentum in healthcare. What do I mean by that? It's quite clear we don't have enough manpower. It's quite clear we don't have enough infrastructure. we don't have enough diagnostic abilities, and most importantly, as I mentioned to you, we don't have analytics. As a doctor for 35 years, my biggest issue has always been that healthcare is local. Nobody wants to travel 500 kilometers to get healthcare. So what we should be focusing on and what we should have done is enable the primary healthcare system. We enable the general practitioner system. We enable electronic health records, and we move towards point of care testing. Unfortunately, in Asia, it has become a very skewed system where we left the wellness, preventive, vaccination to the government, good, bad, ugly. We can debate that later. And we skewed towards the tertiary and quaternary care into the private system. To me, now this needs to come together. The private cannot pretend that it can exist without the public sector, and the public cannot exist without the private sector. And it's high time now that we bring together platforms, share data, talk about the fact how we can prevent disease rather than treating disease. And mind you, this is not the first, this is not the last pandemic. This is not going to be the end of what we are going to see. Thanks to mobility, we are going to see more and more diseases spread forward. My biggest problem is that in the past 18 months, we've focused so much on COVID that we've forgotten this huge burden of chronic lifestyle diseases that we are sitting on the edge of. Strokes have not disappeared. Heart attacks have not gone away. Cancer has not gone away. So hasn't kidney disease. All of these patients, unfortunately, have not been treated, and we are going to see them at a later stage, and we don't have the infrastructure to treat them.
Right. Okay. So taking forward your point on challenges, I mean, you mentioned a couple of them, and with that, the doctor-patient ratio in entire Southeast Asia or most parts of Southeast Asia and even India, where Quadria is so active, that's quite a challenge. The other one is even the dearth of paramedical staff, which goes on to reflect how there's an ardent need to develop, medical workers and build telemedicine, so to speak. So, taking the previous question forward, how do you think we can prepare in the future for another pandemic not to happen, or, a public health crisis? How do we avoid that?
I think I'm going to answer it a bit differently, and what I may say may sound controversial. So let's start with the controversy. I think this is one of many pandemics that we are going to see going forward. And that's because there are some very large ticket items that are taking place in the world, which is A, the now closeness of what used to be wildlife and human habitation. The role of transport and travel, that I can be sitting here today talking to you, and 12 hours from now I could be sitting in the US, which makes a big difference of how I can communicate a disease. The third is the need of populations, even in rural and tier 2, tier 3 cities, to say, wait a minute, why the hell am I getting left behind? Why am I not getting the treatment that I deserve? And lastly, the role of telecommunications, or our ability to actually provide care at far distances without physically being there. To give an example, in a country like India, 1.3 billion people, there are 1 billion mobile phones. We only have 500 million toilets, by the way, but we have 1 billion mobile phones. So what we should be looking at is how do we expand that? And the uniqueness that I see in Asia, whether it's Southeast Asia or South Asia, the problems in healthcare are remarkably simple. Our culture is different, our language is different, our cuisine is different. But the problems in healthcare can boil down to just 3 simple things. Lack of infrastructure, lack of trained manpower, and lack of data analytics to make sense of what we are seeing. If we can start building an electronic health record system, which is mobile, where private or public, we are all part of the same network. Obviously, there are going to be issues with privacy, and I'm not poo-pooing it. But at the end of the day, the common good that we can get off of predicting disease, or predicting the next pandemic, or knowing that when Wuhan was shutting down, this is going to be something much bigger, would be a big difference on how we could treat it.
Right. Right. So you mentioned one crucial point about health tech, especially app-based solutions, say home healthcare or telemedicine. All of them have found huge acceptance among consumers during the pandemic times. But do you think the so-called boom is enough to sort of address the problem that is being faced by the sector overall, given that physical human interaction still somewhere remains, instrumental part of healthcare experience?
There is no debate to my mind, Paramita, that you will not be able to make all of this digital. You can automate as much as you want. There are going to be various facets of healthcare which will get automated for the right reasons. Radiology, pathology, even predictive ophthalmology. You should be able to do things like remote monitoring of chronic diseases. But it will still require acute care to be delivered by trained manpower in hospitals or medical settings to make the diagnosis. I keep saying this. I learn as a doctor every day. In medicine, we pretend it's science. There is a huge element of science and art. When I see a patient for the first time, there are many things that I diagnose, which I won't be able to diagnose remotely. But what I can change is I'm a diabetic. You, Paramita, the doctor, you have fixed it for me. You have made the diagnosis. Now, why do I need to come and see you once every month to show you my blood sugars? Why can't I just show it to you electronically? You should have access to it. You decrease my insulin dose. I think those kind of things will change. I'll give you another example in radiology. We do 100 CT scans a night. 90 of those 100 CT scans are going to be normal. If I can automate that through artificial intelligence, where those 90 scans are automatically screened by artificial intelligence and by telemedicine, and my radiologists are only focused on those 10 scans which actually need them, it could be a huge benefit, both on time efficiency and also on cost.
Got it. Got it. Absolutely. Point noted. Okay, so moving on to another big picture question. You had stated earlier that Asia's healthcare market could actually grow more than that of the US and Europe combined. So could you elaborate on that and what is the math behind?
2021, US and Europe combined spent 4.2 trillion US dollars on healthcare. By 2025, Asia will be spending $4.3 trillion will be spending $4.3 trillion in this. Now think about it for 1 second. Why is this happening? Obviously, we have a much larger population, number one.
Right.
Number two, we are starting at the lower base. Number three, you take any decent Asian healthcare business, it's growing anywhere from 15 to 20% CAGR in revenue every year. I take a standalone standard business in US and Europe, it grows in single digits. So clearly the spend is going to be more, the people are more, the number of companies are more, and we just need, that's it. There's really no rocket science there. If I start looking at the number of people who need care in Asia, by 2025, 50% of the world's population above 65 will be living here in Asia. And as you know, we are living longer, we have more diseases, we have to take care of them. And I mentioned to you this epidemic of lifestyle disease. What do I mean by that?
Right.
Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, kidney disease, and pollution-related lung disease. If I just take these five, and I'm not even counting trauma, which is a massive subset over here, just think of the spend in these, and the numbers will start to pan.
Right, absolutely. So we'll take a pause there. There's a question from the audience here. I don't know if you can see it. It says that I believe you invested in the French Vietnamese hospital in HSMC, Vietnam. Since you invested there, what do you think are some emerging opportunities in Vietnam?
Pramod, I'm a big fan of Vietnam. At the end of the day, it's 100 million smart people, young, who are aspiring to do better in life. I also see Vietnam as one of those emerging economies where adaptation to digital technology is probably the highest. The number of baby diapers, milk, clothes that are bought online in Vietnam is probably higher than any emerging economy in Asia. I also do believe that our investment in FE gave us a fulcrum of having a base. And using that, we are growing through spokes, which is general practitioner clinics, chiropractic clinics, diabetes clinics across. So we were initially invested about 10 years ago in Onmi hospitals, and we grew it through a hub and spoke, and we're doing the same in FE. So quite clearly, we are big fans of Vietnam and its growth. The only challenge sometimes is that Vietnam in many ways is two countries in one. The North behaves, acts very differently to Ho Chi Minh. And just because it has worked in Ho Chi Minh doesn't mean it will work well in the North. But quite clearly, I believe that the government has done a pretty good job of ensuring that there is enough of availability, and they're spending a lot of money in public healthcare, which we are supportive of.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Verma. So moving on from Vietnam, what are your key observations in the other countries that you have invested in Southeast Asia, be it Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore? And I believe you were also looking at opportunities in the Philippines and Thailand. So any progress on that?
Sure. We are based out of Singapore, as you're aware of. This is where our investment manager is based. We are MAS regulated, and we follow all the private equity norms that Singapore and the MAS ask us to do. The reason we are based in Singapore was that we wanted to use Singapore as the base to invest in other countries in Southeast Asia. However, we do have a slight limitation of ticket size. Our equity size is anywhere from a $70 million check all the way up to $200 million. So which, as you can imagine, it requires a certain size of a company, which can absorb our kind of capital, but more importantly, grow along. So the 5 or 6 countries that we are very robust and very aggressive about in Southeast Asia are Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. Those are the 5. Slowly, I'm sure as the Cambodias and the Laoses and the Myanmars grow, we will expand our horizons there. In South Asia, we look at 3 countries primarily. It's India, where we have an advisory office in New Delhi, and we look at Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. I wish I could tell you we were invested in all of these countries. Sometimes it depends on deals and the timing. Clearly, we know these countries quite well. In our past, we've invested in them and exited. So there is a fair understanding. Hopefully, specifically to your question on Thailand and Philippines, we should have something to announce in the next 12 months.
Sure. Okay. So moving on to India and basically the other countries that you want to invest in South Asia. So when do you see that happen? And what is the common thread connecting all these countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia?
So as you're aware, we raised our last fund in 2019 April, which was $600 million. And along with our LPs, we are looking at deploying another $200 to $250 million through this fund. So our total fund size deployment will be anywhere from $800 to $900 million. We are currently halfway through already. In fact, we should be by the end of this year, we're doing something else in Vietnam, and we should end up with almost 75% deployed. Answer to your question is, we believe that Quadria would be completely deployed by end of 2022.
Okay. So you raised about 600 million last year, and in addition to that, you raised another 50 million, or rather 48 million odd dollars for a parallel fund. So how do the two funds differ from each other? And can you elaborate on that? And I also believe you're looking to close a VC fund, right?
Sure. So the VC fund is the parallel fund that we raised. We call it an early stage healthcare fund. It's called HealthQuad. This was co-sponsored by the Quadria GP, and there are a couple of Quadria LPs who have also joined it, along with a gentleman called Charles Antoine Janssen, who's the CIO. Charles used to be an operating partner with Quadria, and he decided to take a full-time role. The answer to that is very simple. Why did we raise it? We at Quadria are a growth private equity fund.
Right.
And as I mentioned to you, our minimum check size is 70. What we are seeing, however, is that there is a robust, vibrant, energetic startup healthcare ecosystem, not just in India, but across Southeast Asia, which requires smaller amount of check sizes, but also require mentorship. So it's not just about the money. It's also about helping them scale and grow. So our view was that if we raise the parallel fund with a parallel team, we would not just get across to the growth sector, but we would also help venture, or call it early stage. I hate getting pawned into venture versus growth versus bio. We would also help earlier companies grow through this. So two different infrastructures. Right now, we've raised HealthQuad for India. We did our first close at $70 million. We are looking at closing the fund anywhere around 150 million mark by the end of this calendar year. And our intent is to raise something similar for Southeast Asia next year.
Okay. So when do we see that happen?
I think if the team gets its act together on getting this fund closed, I think somewhere in the first quarter of next year, we should start the HealthQuad Southeast Asia fundraise.
Sure. And any corpus that you're planning on that? In terms
be about $100 million, which we believe is the right size.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So moving on to the next one, healthcare, we all understand comes under the essential services. And you spoke, of course, about the mammoth opportunities. But what is it taking so long for Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian nations to generate unicorns in the sector? India, of course, generated 2 this year, but that's also late. So why this delay?
I think it's just size and the desegregated market. The problem that we see in this part of the world, both South and Southeast Asia, suffer from the same problem. I could be, when I make a comment, I could be talking about India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the same problem, is scaling it up to size. And part of the problem, which I want the audience and you, Paramita, to understand, is who pays for this. So if I'm in Europe, it's a socialized system. In the US, it's a private system, which less is said than ever, because you would be reading the news about a $380 COVID test, which costs less than $20 anywhere in the world. So it's a bit of an extortionist mechanism. I think in this part of the world, our problem is we are still confused as to who pays for it. If I were to look across my portfolio, 70% of my patients are still paying out of pocket, and only 30% have any form of public or private insurance. And to me, the scalability and bringing it up to size, and I think that's one of the benefits, I hate using that word, one of the benefits COVID has done, is that it is bringing into fore the need for creating scale. Why is that important? As COVID hit us, 2-3 realizations happened. And to me, those are positive. The first thing that happened is that we've been living off 100 years of dogmas in medicine that this cannot be done. We've always done medicine this way. Doctors in particular are very, very clear. This is the way it has been done. You can't think of anything else. We were able to go back to them saying, maybe it worked earlier. Let's do it this way. So that's happened. The second thing, we went back and looked at a supply chain. The supply chain was snapped in a space of 24 hours. Movement stopped, patient stopped, consumables stopped, medicine stopped. So this time around, we started looking at diversifying our supply chain. So we were able to look at we were looking at local warehousing, we looked at distributors. So our supply chain has actually become very, very robust, both in hospitals and also on pharma, when I look at API and things like that we do. And the third thing that happened was that we were able to go back to all of our industries. And the first thing we said was, let's be solvent. Let's protect cash. So cost efficiencies, whether it was manpower, whether it was how we bought, whether it was CapEx, everything was looked at. And for the first time, COVID gave us the ability of going to a white canvas board and say, let's restart. Let's say, this is not the way it's done. Let's make it. I'm just hoping that we can hold on to these and we can use this to become far more efficient as we go forward. It's quite clearly, and you mentioned and you alluded to this earlier, technology is going to be the big enabler. Will technology be the savior of everything? I think a Google Health implosion has shown us that it can't be just technology. It has to be technology and people. If we can get a nice marriage between them, we should be able to do this well.
Sure, absolutely. That's very, very well said, Dr. Verma. So moving on to the next question, that's been bothering everybody. What do you think about the exit market in healthcare sector in Southeast Asia and India, where you invest in? In India, we have seen a robust IPO market right now. So do you think that boom is here to stay? That's my part one in terms of the question. The second one is, you closed your first fund, I think, in 2015 with a corpus of 300 million. So what I understand is it's been fully exhausted. So what are the
Almost.
portfolio companies that are right for
Almost
you?
completely exited.
All of them? Sorry?
Almost completely exited. By next year,
Okay.
we will be completely exited from that.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So, what is your view about the bustling IPO market in India? Do you think that's going to make it easier for investors to exit in the healthcare space as well?
Without a doubt, I honestly believe that the market in Asia has become a lot more sophisticated. People have started believing the fact that it's not just enough to invest. One of the biggest problems is not just about healthcare, but across Asian PE, the criticism that we used to get from our LPs in the US and the West was all this, the macro is very nice, the PowerPoints look very glossy. Show me the money. Where are you exits? And Asia traditionally has suffered from this issue of not being able to exit. I think we've been able to solve it through the public markets, through a very robust secondaries. And now you see a lot more strategic investments taking place. So quite honestly, if you'd asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have told you exiting in Asia is a challenge. You ask me today, there are various ways of making that happen at decent returns.
Right. That applies to Southeast Asia as well, is what you're saying.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. We are beginning, I mean, quite interestingly, India is ahead of the curve when it comes to IPOs. But if you go to Indonesia, Singapore, and increasingly Manila and even Vietnam, the stock markets are very small, so they can't absorb that much. But we are beginning to see now the behavior, and you will see in the next 2 to 3 years, you will see a lot more exits through the public.
Right. Okay. That's absolutely heartening to hear. So my last question here, because we have a paucity of time. So what do you think about China's crackdown on technology companies? Do you think that's going to prompt global investors to look for more opportunities? And will that have an impact on the life sciences space as such?
So two things. So one, answering the China question, it's quite clear. Pretty large conglomerates took place. A lot of large conglomerates were in businesses that they probably should not have been in. But it was allowed in some ways because it was being more efficient and it was saving the end customer money. Sometimes too big to fail may not necessarily be true, especially when it comes to China. I believe that the world, especially in healthcare, has just too much opportunity to worry about China shutting down because now India will take off. I think there's more to be done. To my mind, competition does not exist between China, ASEAN, India. It's about growing from within. I think it could be done. The benefit that we are seeing is that, yes, there is a lot of health tech, quote unquote, which is moving from China to ASEAN and India. Clearly, in the pharma space, there has been a tightening a bit of API, but then we also learned the hard way when COVID happened, is that you will have to make it on your own. Don't just depend on cheap imports coming from anywhere in the world. So I think we are beginning to see that. And I truly believe that we have seen a much more robust healthcare system evolve post-COVID. And I sound like an eternal optimist, but this is my firm belief. The next 10 years are all about Asian healthcare. We will do well.
Sure. Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Verma. There's one question from audience here, quite a few I can see, but we'll take up one quickly before we wind up. This is, what is the logic in picking up a minority stake in Indonesia's Medica Loka Hermina?
Sure. At the end of the day, Medica is, Hermina is a public listed company, 47 hospitals. We build 4 to 5 hospitals every year. They started off as a women and children's hospital, became a general hospital. And our belief is that we bringing centers of excellence. So we'll help them evolve to specialty hospitals, at least in the larger hospitals. Having a minority stake over there gives us board positions, gives us influence, and we're able to grow it. At the end of the day, yes, I'm a private equity firm. Yes, I have to return money to my investors, but we're also here for the larger good of improving Indonesian healthcare in the private sector. That was the great logic of it.
Sure. So thank you very much. I think that was indeed a very, very in-depth session. And you took us through almost all aspects of life sciences and the contours, and stuff. So thank you very much once again, and look forward to being in touch with you. Yeah.
Appreciate the time, appreciate the opportunity to speak to you candidly. And for all of the people who are on the panel, please do reach out directly. I'm happy to answer your questions, which we could not because of scarcity of time.
Thank you once again. Yeah.
Thanks.